Good morning and welcome to this presentation on Urban Living Labs. My name is Timo van Wild from the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions in the Netherlands. That's also the reason why I cannot be with you today in person, unfortunately, because here on campus in Rotterdam, it's still the end of the semester and I have to teach today. But I'm very happy to follow the invitation by the Joint Programming Initiative, JPI Urban Europe today, and to provide you with some of our insights and lessons learned about urban living labs in Europe in this virtual environment. I hope that my presentation will be beneficial for you and useful for your future work. And let's get started now with the presentation. To provide you briefly with an insight about my personal background, so that you know who is talking to you, I am a senior researcher and lecturer at the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, DRIFT. This is located at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. My background is in economics and geography, and my work currently focuses on urban transitions and the questions of how innovations diffuse towards more sustainable pathways, as well as placemaking and quality of life and well-being in cities. Secondly, I want to shortly give you a description of the background of the projects that we draw a lot of our insights from in terms of urban living labs, and that's the project GUST, Governance of Urban Sustainability Transitions. And we were privileged to receive funding from JPI Urban Europe for a 3-year research project, particularly on the format or the platform of urban living labs across Europe. And we did this together with partners from the UK, Durham University, from Austria, Johanneum Research, and from Sweden, Lund University. And we looked into 40 URL cases across Europe. And then we also did more detailed studies in these 4 cities of Malmö, Graz, Newcastle, and Rotterdam. And most of the insights that I'm sharing today with you basically build on the results and findings from this project. So let's get started. This is how I have structured today's input. So in the first part, I will provide you really with some background knowledge and definitions on our understanding of urban living labs and the promise behind this format. What is the intention and rationale why urban living labs is currently quite a promising and proliferating format in the context of particularly sustainability transformation in cities. And then secondly, I will give you some more detailed information on the ideas of local experimentation and co-creation, 2 concepts that are closely related to the idea of working and operating with urban living labs. And finally, I think it's important also to take a critical perspective, and then I will close my input after roughly 25 minutes. And I hope that this will be insightful and beneficial for your future work. Now let's start with the context. Why are we addressing with urban living labs, particularly the urban setting and cities? Well, most of you will be fully aware of this, I'm sure, but let us just remind ourselves that cities are the nuclei of today's sustainability challenges. This is mostly due to the density of persons, of practices, which today still remain rather unsustainable. And this is also why within cities, the Sustainable Development Goal, number 11, really puts an emphasis on transforming these areas towards more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable environments. At the same time, the density in cities offers really an opportunity to use these areas, to use cities and urban areas as a leverage point in transforming towards alternative ways of doing and organizing our lives. But the question is, how do we do so? because we may have the hypothesis that the existing, for example, planning practices of developing a city have failed to do so. So maybe we should talk about the question of addressing these sustainability challenges in cities with other formats, other methods, and other settings. So we could say the challenge is really nowadays globally to create substantial, deep structural change in cities. But I'm sure you agree that we should be a bit more explicit than you see in this funny figure. And one approach and one way of thinking about doing things differently in cities is the notion of experimentation. And I want to summarize quickly why this seems to be important. Well, as mentioned a minute ago, improving the urban living conditions is nowadays subject due to large uncertainties, to contestation, and the city environment is facing an increasing complexity, particularly due to a fast growth of cities around the globe. And what we also observe is that the capacities to govern, or the idea to steer in cities for certain actors, is rather limited and fragmented. With fragmented, I refer to the fact that often there are different sectors that try to steer the city, and some of them have capacities and agencies to do so, others not. And this blocks and is a barrier towards more sustainable pathways. Now, and these challenges, which obviously are summarized in a very compact form here, they really overflow currently the institutional arrangements, the current ways of planning and developing a city. And they demand for greater institutional flexibility. And this institutional flexibility might occur if we would take a more provisional and adaptive understanding of cities. If we would look at cities more as an emerging and clearly heterogeneous urban setting or urban assemblage. And then, if we take this position, experimentation would provide a means, would provide an approach by which different urban actors try to navigate and to co-create visions and solutions for the future city life. And here's the point: urban living labs then could be considered as one particular mode or one particular format of experimentation in cities. And when arguing here, I'm mainly referring to recent works by Harriet Bulkley, our colleague Harriet Bulkley, and James Evans. And I really can recommend you the book that you see here, The Experimental City, by James Evans and colleagues, if you want to see and learn more about this argumentation. Well, here we are now in the topic. So I have introduced urban living labs as one mode or one form of taking a position of a more experimental lens to think and do and practice within cities towards more livable futures. Here are two very classical, straightforward definitions. What are urban living labs? Within our projects, my colleague Yulia Voitenko, in her publication 2016, came up with this definition that urban living labs are sites in cities where you can design, test, and learn from social and technical innovation within a real-world setting. And James Evans and Andrew Karvonen pronounced more the institutional bounded environment to make interventions in the city and learn from them. And what these two definitions have in common, you see that immediately, is the emphasis on learning. So urban living labs really are platforms where different urban actors together collaborate in testing and trialing new things out, but particularly where they can learn from each other about the new solutions and about potential implementations of these tests in other areas of the cities or into policy regulations. So learning is really key for urban living labs. And we could call this new arenas to collaborate, to trial, to demonstrate. And one outcome may be from these learning processes, may be the concept of actionable knowledge, so that we know when we intervene which works and which intervention did not work, so that we then could move towards implementing these lessons learned in other contexts. And what we currently see is that the living lab idea has an evolution. The concept of living lab itself is more than 25 years old, and it originally came from user-driven innovation from companies, so in the private sector. But now the living lab idea moved also into the public sector and particularly into cities with the notion of urban living labs, and it more became this arena of social technical transformation and testing and collaborating towards sustainability transitions. You can consider urban living labs as an innovation in itself, because the way these platforms are nowadays operated and introduced in cities, that represents a new way of doing, thinking, and organizing activities within cities. So you could say a ULL is a social innovation as such. At the same time, within the ULL, obviously there's the idea to seed and to breed new sustainability initiatives, startups that provide new products or services or ideas that contribute to more livable and sustainable cities. So at the same time, ULL are kind of the sites and the containers in which social innovations shall emerge and shall accelerate from. So there's this duality in terms of the innovative aspects of urban living labs. Now, let me quickly summarize some of the main characteristics where we think, based on the GUST project, that ULLs really are a promising format that we should further look into, and that at least several new projects are worth building on. So it is the geographically embeddedness that the tests and the trials can take place in a real world setting, with the real citizens, neighbors, engaged organizations and other actors, which obviously brings a lot of uncertainty and fuzziness compared to traditional university laboratories with a very controlled setting. But on the other hand, that's really a beauty, that you can test new technologies, new business models, new behavior patterns, new practices in a real world setting. What most of the ULLs also share is a strong common vision where they want to go, a sustainability vision. What they also have in common is the early involvement of citizens, of users, and of diverse other actors, for example, from municipalities, from research institutions, from the private sector, or citizens as such. And that these different societal domains collaborate together in urban living labs, that's not so common still today. And that requires obviously modes of collaborating and working together. And one notion in this context is the idea of co-creation, of knowledge and of the learning outcomes. And I will get to this concept of co-creation within urban living labs in a minute. Let's also comment on this final bullet point. Most of the urban living labs that we studied, they also emphasize the integration of constantly monitoring and evaluating the operations and the doing and the emerging networks and outcomes from the lab activities. And I really want to stress this point. If you are thinking about setting up an urban living lab, please consider early enough how you, in an ongoing sense, can monitor and evaluate what is happening there, who is learning what, and what are the outcomes. Excuse me. Now, as mentioned on the previous slide, one of the key modes, so to say, to operate within the different actors of a living lab is co-creation. You could say, well, the most easiest and simplistic definition of co-creation is doing things together, for example, across societal boundaries. And here, in the context of ULL, we could say urban actors from these different societal domains, companies from the private sector, academic institutes, civil servants from the municipality, citizens from the neighborhood, they normally still do not necessarily meet, they often do not understand each other, and they still rarely cooperate intensively in urban development projects. And one of the key ideas behind ULL, at least of those that we studied in Europe, is to offer this arena for more inclusive, for more participatory, and you could call it more do-it-yourself, a do-it-yourself forum that allows creating sustainable innovations and creating visions for reshaping the city together. And I cannot go further into detail here, but you will find a lot of recent literature on co-creation itself and on ways to implement it in living labs. I only recommend the paper of my colleague Emma Puerari from this year, and I will provide you the reference at the end of this presentation. Now, one of the outcomes within our GUS project was, you could say, a typology of living labs. Excuse me. And we identified three main types of ULL, and this outcome mainly goes back to which institution is the main driving actor, how are the funding mechanisms behind, and what are the type of tests and trialing in the urban living lab. And we find these three types: the strategic living lab, where you mostly see governments or large companies or private actors behind it. And they have a very strategic idea of, for example, testing new products within the real world and within the urban arena. A second group of labs that we saw, we called civic urban living labs, civic ULL. These are often rather research driven. So a university or an academic institution might be the main initiator and driving institution behind these ULLs. And they often put an emphasis more on research in real world context, but obviously there can also overlapping aspects with the strategic ULL. And then finally, we see a third group we could call grassroots ULL. You may refer to this more as a bottom-up initiatives, where you see citizens and civil society actors or not-for-profit actors in the lead. And they often focus more on very broad agendas of well-being in rather small projects, often due to the fact that their funding is more limited and is smaller, for example, compared to the strategic ULLs. And to make this a bit more concrete, let me show you one example from the city of Rotterdam of a living lab that we have studied in detail, and where we would say this is basically an overlap of a strategic living lab with a grassroots living lab. Because on the one hand, you had several very engaged citizens with this urban living lab, which is called Blue City Lab, that really were initiating startups and new sustainability experimenting in this building. But then at a later stage, also the municipality and other private actors became strategically interested in supporting this lab to further emerge. And in short, the story behind this building is it's a former tropical swimming pool within the city at a very prominent location. And it was now transformed into an experimental space. So it was an empty building and it was transformed into an experimental space where startups can do trials and tests for a waste-free or a waste-neutral building within the city. So there is the idea to demonstrate within this large former swimming pool, to demonstrate together with startups and citizens and other actors that a circular building, a waste-free building, is possible within the city of Rotterdam. And what we see now is in this Blue City Lab that it really transformed into a very creative place that has this startup atmosphere, and that even in the part of this former swimming pool, you now have startups and entrepreneurs that work with new circular, more sustainable business models towards scaling them up, and that the building overall is raising a lot of interest. And they have over 10,000 visitors per year now that they became this experimental platform for the circular economy. If you are interested, you will find this immediately for further information on the web, Blue City Lab in the city of Rotterdam. Now, one final part in this second section of my presentation is an important question, and that is, are urban living labs an effective forum to really initiate broader transformation and broader change in cities? So how do urban living labs impact on change in cities? I cannot go in, unfortunately, into detail here, but what I can say is, and I'm summarizing this with this quote by our colleague James Evans, that the potential of urban living labs will be realized when the lessons learned in the urban living labs are transferred, are applied to other places, to other organizations, and particularly get embedded in regulations and city policies. And the ways how this functions, we have written a recent publication on this, and I will provide you, I'm happy to provide you with this reference in the end of the presentation. Now, what you see on the right-hand side is one of the outcomes from our project, and you can download it for free. It's a handbook, it's a PDF handbook on the emerging landscape of urban living labs. And to summarize some of the outcomes that from our studies, if you are planning to enter or to set up an urban living lab, for example, in your city with different partners, these 4 steps, you could say the 4 E's, might help you in doing this successfully. So what we see is that the process of envisioning together in this co-creative setting across different urban actors is very crucial. And to have a quite radical vision for your ULL will increase the later visibility of your operations. So creating a strong vision for what you want to do in the beginning, and creating legitimacy among all the actors involved is an important step. Secondly, what we see is that those urban living labs who on purpose are strongly embedded locally, that connect with neighbors, that connect with local other actors that are not yet involved, that this really helps them being on the radar, that this helps them creating visitors and visibility. So the local embedding in the local context is also an important aspect. Thirdly, experimentation and the openness to learn new, and a reconsideration that failure is allowed within urban living labs is also an important point. And doing this collaboratively with practices of co-creation is quite central. And finally, in terms of the impact and in terms of diffusion of the outcomes and dissemination of the lessons learned from urban living labs, exchange intensively with actors from outside the living lab. That will increase the likelihood that the lessons learned within the lab also find their ways into other places, other organizations, or into changes in policies. Now, let me, in the last part, get to this critical outlook that I mentioned, because so far you have heard a lot of promising and and rather positive aspects and characteristics of this new form of collaborating within cities. But I also want to ask a bit for caution to stay critical due to several aspects that we simply are lacking knowledge about. And I would be careful to call urban living labs the new panacea of urban transformation. And these are the main reasons. What we see in some of the labs is a certain risk that if all actors agree to experiment and to have this openness, that this might also end up, as Ulrich Beck, the sociologist Ulrich Beck called this, a form of organized irresponsibility. So there needs to, in this experimental arrangement of a living lab, there needs to be at least one actor that is really pushing the development further and that takes responsibility for the outcomes, for the learning processes, for the process design, and for the inclusiveness, being open for other actors. Secondly, this is the third point here on this slide, there are still a couple of open questions in terms of agency, who is selected to become a partner or not, and also the legitimacy of the outcomes of urban living labs. So there might occur questions of exclusivity, why certain partners in a lab are included and others not. This might be an important aspect in early phases of bringing partners together to address explicitly. And finally, my fourth point on this slide, there's still an interesting knowledge gap with how we can link the outcomes and outputs from urban living labs from these more open experimental spaces with the existing ways of more formalized decision-making and planning in cities, and how top-down decision-making may be linked to the insights from urban living labs. And there are existing projects working on this, so please keep your eyes open, and I'm sure there will come new publications on this soon. And the last point I want to mention before closing is, at the moment, what we see is that this concept of urban living labs is very prominent, and it's quite hip, you could say. And I would ask, at least for caution, to look a bit more into detail what the single lab is providing as a format as such. So I think in the future, we should really focus on certain types of labs, of certain more insightful research on the ways how labs initiate towards broader transformation. And I would at least ask to avoid lab washing, so that every city needs to have several labs just to be innovative. No, it's also about the question, what is happening in there and what are the concrete outcomes? So let's summarize some of the open questions from our perspective that remain on urban living labs. We see still an undiscovered potential for placemaking and urban regeneration that has not been studied so much in detail. Secondly, as mentioned on an earlier slide, it's not yet fully clear how the capabilities, but also the limitations are to take urban living labs as an instrument, as an explicit instrument for urban governance. And finally, that's why I emphasize this aspect of monitoring and evaluation. It's still not very transparent who is learning what in urban living labs and how this contributes to capacity building in the city among different actors. And as promised in the beginning, these are some recent publications from our groups, but also from other researchers that I would recommend you, and I'm very happy to share these slides with you. And if you look to the fourth bullet points, this is the web page of the GUS project, so www.urbanlivinglabs.net, and you will find, for example, this PDF handbook and other resources on urban living labs on this page. I want to conclude with the comment that obviously these insights are not solely my own work. And that's why I want to draw your attention on my collaborators you see up here on these slides. Harriet Bulkley and others were all involved in this project. I thank you for listening, and I wish you a successful workshop in Rio de Janeiro. If you have any questions related to this presentation or input, please do not hesitate to send me an email, and I look forward getting back to you then. All the best, and bye-bye.